In the haunting silence of an Istanbul dawn in 1623, when the Bosphorus lay still under a pale mist, a cry rose within the marble heart of Topkapi. Palace a sound no imperial scribe dared to record. It was not the roar of cannons or the clash of swords, but a human scream, sharp and trembling, echoing down golden corridors. Some said it came from a girl barely 15, a princess born of divine blood and imperial command. She was Fatima Sultan, daughter of one of the most powerful rulers the world had ever known. And that morning, her voice was the only rebellion left to her. The echoes of her terror rippled through the silent courtyards, reaching even the eunuchs who guarded the harem and trained to suppress emotion and fear. Yet, they too hesitated, for what could they do when the agony came not from a slave or concubine, but from the daughter of the Sultan himself? It was said that no one dared move until her cries faded into a whimper. Then silence returned, thick as the marble walls that had heard countless secrets before. Historians would never write about that scream. The official chronicles recorded only triumphs, treaties, and royal births. But the whispers that flowed through Istanbul's narrow alleys told a different story, one of pain buried beneath the empire's splendor. They spoke of a hidden price paid by every daughter of a sultan when she came of age, a price not written in ink, but etched into their souls. The empire's historians called the Ottoman dynasty a miracle of governance and faith, a machine of order that stretched across 3 continents. But in the shadows of that greatness, in the perfumed chambers of the palace, there lived another empire, one of silence, fear, and obedience. It was ruled not by the sultan, but by ancient rituals designed to mold even royal daughters into instruments of control. For centuries, the people outside those gilded gates could only imagine what life inside might be. They saw the palaces gleam like heaven on earth, filled with gardens, fountains, and laughter. But the women who lived there, the concubines, wives, and princesses, carried stories that no ballad dared to sing. Behind the soft silks and jeweled curtains lay a truth so cruel that no European court, however decadent, could rival its quiet terror. And among those untold stories was that of Fatima Sultan. Born in 1606, she was the daughter of Sultan Ahmed I and the formidable Kaiksem Sultana woman who herself had ruled from the shadows, manipulating thrones and fates with a whisper. Fatima's childhood was a portrait of imperial perfection. Within the walls of Topkapi, she was surrounded by gardens perfumed with jasmine and tulips, by poets, musicians, and scholars who bowed to her brilliance. Even as a child, she astonished her tutors. She mastered 4 languages, wrote poetry that shimmered with intellect, and debated astronomy and law with the empire's finest minds. To the outside world, she was the jewel of the dynasty, an image of grace, knowledge, and royal serenity. But within the harem, beauty and wisdom were not gifts, they were dangers. Because in the Ottoman court, a princess's destiny was not her own. Her birthright was her burden. From the moment she took her first breath, her name was inscribed not in lullabies, but in treaties and political plans. She was born not to love, but to serve the empiress. Designs to be married off like a precious seal, binding alliances and calming rebellions. And so, while poets praised her brilliance, the court scribes quietly prepared her fate. The man chosen for her was no youthful prince or romantic hero, but Kara Mustafa Pasha, battle-hardened commander, 20 years her senior, known for his victories and cruelty alike. For him, marrying the Sultan's daughter was the path to greater power. For her, it was the beginning of an unending night. Not even her mother, Kaiksem Sultan, once the most powerful woman in the empire, could protect her, because the empire demanded obedience even from its queens. And Fatima was about to learn what obedience truly meant. The first whispers of her preparation began months before the wedding. Officially, it was called Terbi Mubarak, the Bless, training. But those who served within the palace knew it by another name, the ritual of breaking. An elderly attendant, Gulnahatan, was assigned to oversee the process. What followed was not education, but erasure. Fatima's world shrank from the vast halls of learning to a single dim chamber lit by candles. Every movement was now choreographed. She was taught to walk, bow, and speak in precise patterns, each one meant to teach humility. Her vocabulary was reduced to a handful of words: gratitude, apology, acceptance. obedience. Each mistake brought punishment. A missed bow meant fasting. A word out of turn meant confinement in darkness. She was no longer a scholar, a princess. She was being reshaped into an offering. And the stories only grew darker. Witnesses later spoke of strange rehearsals conducted in underground chambers. Wax figures, carved by Venetian artisans, stood in the dim light figures of men. There, the young princess was ordered to practice gestures of submission to mimic rituals of the wedding night. It was said to be instruction, but to any who heard the whispers, it sounded like something far more sinister. Every hesitation, every sign of defiance, was carefully noted in secret ledgers. No other court in the world, they said, treated its princesses this way. But the Ottoman palace had always been a place where power disguised cruelty with ceremony. As her training continued, humiliation became her daily prayer. Twice each week, she was made to serve her father's concubines, bathing them, dressing them, arranging their veils. The message was unmistakable. Even her father's lovers stood above her. By the time the wedding was announced, Fatima Sultan's laughter had vanished. Her tutors said her eyes no longer reflected the stars she once studied. She spoke little, and when she did, it was in whispers. Those who saw her said she moved like a ghost through the corridors of Topkapi, her silence louder than any cry. And yet, the empire celebrated. The day of the royal wedding was set for March 5th, 10th, 1623. Outside the palace, drums thundered, incense filled the air, and the streets shimmered with color. To the people, it was a festival, a sign of divine harmony. But inside the palace walls, one girl's world was collapsing into silence. The wedding day dawned beneath a blood-orange sky, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to bless what was about to unfold. From the city's rooftops, the call to prayer echoed across the Bosphorus, mingling with the sounds of drums, flutes, and celebration. Istanbul shimmered with color and noise. Streets were lined with silk banners, and every fountain overflowed with rose petals. To the people, it was a day of joy, the sacred union of the Sultan's daughter and one of the empire's greatest generals. But behind the towering gates of Topkapi Palace, a different silence hung in the air. Inside her chamber, Fatima Sultan sat motionless before a mirror framed in gold. The reflection staring back at her was barely her own. Layers of white silk and jewels covered her like armor, but her eyes, once alive with wonder, were empty, distant, unreadable. Around her, the attendants worked in silence. Every pin, every strand of hair was adjusted with trembling hands, for none dared meet her gaze. They knew the fate that awaited her was not a union of love, but of submission and fear. Outside, cannon fire roared in salute. The empire celebrated what it believed was divine order, the binding of two powerful names. But those who served inside whispered of the truth, that the young princess had wept until dawn, her tears soaking into her wedding veil. When the grand procession began, it was as if the entire world bowed before her. Thousands of soldiers stood in lines of silver and red. Nobles filled the marble courtyards. The air smelled of musk and burning amber. Musicians played hymns of devotion, their melodies soaring through the open arches. Yet amid all the splendor, the bride moved like a statue carved from sorrow. Each step she took echoed on the marble floor, slow, deliberate, final. The eunuchs flanked her like shadows, ensuring not a single word escaped her lips. From the balcony, her mother, Kaiksem Sultan, watched in silence. Her expression betrayed nothing, but her fingers clenched the railing until her knuckles turned white. Perhaps only she knew what it meant to sacrifice a daughter to the empire's unyielding will. As Fatima reached the great courtyard, the crowd erupted in cheers. The Pasha, her husband Tubi, stood tall beside the Sultan's throne. His eyes were cold, assessing, filled with the pride of victory. For him, this was not a wedding. It was conquest. And as their eyes met, Fatima felt the air thicken around her, as though the entire world had narrowed to that single, suffocating gaze. The ceremony itself was brief, a whisper of words exchanged under the gaze of the empire's holy men. But when the ritual ended, when the blessings were spoken and the crowd bowed their heads, Fatima knew her freedom had ended with them. She was no longer a princess of the Ottoman dynasty. She was now Property. A symbol. A prize. A vessel for alliances and heirs. Night fell swiftly over Istanbul. The celebration outside continued long after sunset. Fireworks lit the sky, and poets sang of beauty, loyalty, and divine fate. But in the inner palace, deep within the gilded chambers, a darker ritual awaited. The so-called wedding night ceremony, a tradition as ancient as the empire itself, was about to begin. The attendants led her through narrow halls, illuminated by oil lamps. Shadows danced along the walls, bending and twisting like restless spirits. Her heartbeat echoed louder with each step. When she reached the chamber, Telunix pushed open the heavy door. The room inside was draped in crimson velvet, its air thick with incense and silence. In the center stood the Pasha, his face half hidden behind a golden mask, a symbol of authority, not mystery. Fatima trembled, her body rigid, her breath shallow. Every instinct told her to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The ritual began not with words, but with gestures. He removed his gloves and placed his hand upon her head, a mark of possession. She lowered her eyes, as tradition demanded, though every fiber of her being screamed against it. The air grew colder, heavier, as the attendants withdrew, leaving them alone. Outside the chamber, the guards heard no sound, only the faint rustle of silk, the soft murmur of ritual words. Hours later, when the door finally opened, Fatima emerged pale and silent. Her hair was undone, airbale torn. The eunuchs escorted her back to her private quarters, where she collapsed beside the window overlooking the dark waters of the Bosphorus. No tears came, only a long, empty stare into the night. From that day on, Fatima Sultana's world became one of shadows and whispers. The grand halls that once echoed with her laughter were now prisons of marble and gold. Her husband, the Pasha, visited only when commanded by the Sultan. To the court, they were the perfect couple, loyal, regal, unbroken. But behind the silken curtains, the truth was colder. The Pasha ruled his home as he ruled the battlefield through fear and discipline. Every word, every gesture of Fatima's was measured and observed. Yet somewhere within that silence, something inside her refused to die. She began to write again, not poetry for the court, but secret verses hidden beneath her mattress. Her ink was made from crushed pomegranate seeds. Her paper, torn from the edges of palace decrees. Those poems, written in secret, carried the weight of 1,000 unshed tears. They spoke of longing, of injustice, of freedom denied. One night, a servant discovered one of her verses and, in fear, brought it to Kaiksim Sultan. When the mother read her daughter's words, her heart broke, for she saw in them her own reflection, the same pain, the same rebellion she had once buried to survive. From that night onward, Kaiksim visited Fatima in secret. She would come cloaked in darkness, bring in comfort, food, and forbidden hope. But even the walls had ears. Rumors of Fatima's writings reached the Pasha. One morning, he entered her chamber unannounced, holding one of her secret pages. Without a word, he tore it to shreds before her eyes. Then, with chilling calm, he whispered, "A wife's thoughts belong to her husband, not the world." That night, Fatima stood at her window again, staring at the stars. The Bosphorus shimmered beneath the moonlight, vast and eternal. For the first time in months, she let her tears fall freely. She whispered a promise to herself, a promise of defiance, of survival, of someday being heard. And though no one in the empire could have known it then, that single promise would one day echo far beyond the palace walls. Days turned into months, and months into years. Yet the corridors of Topkapi Palace never changed. The same marble floors, the same painted ceilings, the same whispers that slithered through the night. Fatima had learned to wear silence like a veil. Outwardly calm, inwardly burning. Her life, though gilded, had become a quiet cage. But every cage has a crack, and she had begun to find hers through words, through memory, through the faint hope that someday her name would mean more than sorrow. The empire outside continued to thrive. Wars were fought, lands conquered, alliances forged. But inside the palace, the battles were quieter, fought with secrets, smiles, and poison in golden cups. The Pasha's ambition grew like a disease. He longed not just for power, but for the throne itself. And Fatima, though bound to him by law and fear, saw through every mask he wore. One night, as rain lashed the palace windows, Kaiksem Sultan summoned her daughter to her private chambers. The candles flickered weakly, throwing trembling shadows across the walls. Kaiksem stood by the window, her once black hair streaked with silver, her face carved by years of power and loss. "My daughter," she said softly, "you are living the life I once feared for you. I built an empire to protect you, and yet the same empire devours you." Fatima lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Then why, mother, do we stay silent?" Kaisem's eyes glistened, but her tone remained cold. "Because silence keeps us alive. Speak too loud, and they will bury your name before the echo fades." Fatima turned away, tears burning her eyes. "Then let them bury me," she murmured, "but they will remember what I said." Those words were the spark. From that moment, something within her shifted. She began to act with quiet defiance, small gestures, careful steps, yet each one a rebellion. She refused to attend the grand councils. She declined to appear beside her husband in public ceremonies. And most dangerous of all, she began sending secret letters, messages of mercy to imprisoned poets, wives, and widows across the city. The whispers of her defiance soon reached the Sultan's court. Advisors murmured that Fatima was no longer a loyal wife, that her heart had turned against the empire. The Pasha, consumed by pride and paranoia, saw her not as a wife, but as a threat. His visits grew harsher, his temper shorter. Each confrontation left deeper wounds, not on her skin, but on her soul. Then came the night that changed everything. It was the first night of spring, the air thick with jasmine. The palace was unusually still. Fatima sat by her writing table, a single candle flickering beside her, as she penned what would become her final letter. It was not to her husband, nor to her mother, but to the future, to the women who would one day walk these same halls and face the same chains. Her words were simple, but each carried fire. They will cage you with gold and call it honor. They will silence you and name it obedience. But remember, a voice once raised, even in whisper, can outlive 1,000 swords. As she sealed the letter, the door creaked open. The Pasha stood there, his face half hidden in the candlelight, his expression unreadable. He had come not as a husband, but as a judge. "So," he said quietly, "the rumors are true. You write not of love, but rebellion." Fatima rose to her feet. Her heart raced, but her voice was calm. "I write of truth, and truth frightens only those who live by lies." For a long moment, there was silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Then the Pasha stepped closer, his hand tightening around the hilt of his dagger. "Your words could cost you everything," he hissed. "They already have," she whispered. What happened next would be whispered in the palace for generations, though no one would ever tell it the same way. Some said the Pasha struck her down in anger. Others claimed she took her own life rather than kneel. But what is known is this. By morning, her chambers were sealed, her name erased from court records, and her husband was sent away under imperial command. When Kaiksem Sultan heard the news, she did not cry. She simply walked to the balcony overlooking the Bosphorus, the same place where her daughter had once stood, and whispered a prayer to the wind. The empire could erase names, but not echoes. Days later, a sealed letter appeared on her desk. The one Fatima had written that final night. Kaiksem read it in silence, her tears falling on the ink. And in that moment, the most powerful woman in the Ottoman world broke not with anger, but with sorrow. Years passed. The empire changed hands again and again, but the story of Fatima Sultan refused to die. Servants whispered it to one another by lamplight. Poets reimagined it in secret verses. Even the walls of Topkapi seemed to remember her. The faint scent of pomegranate ink. The ghost of footsteps in the quiet corridors. Centuries later, historians would debate whether she ever existed as the records described. Some said she was a myth, a legend born of rebellion. But for those who looked deeper, they found her name, scratched faintly on the underside of a marble balcony, hidden from sight. Just 3 words, carved by a trembling hand. I was here. And perhaps that was her final victory. To exist beyond the erasure, beyond the fear, beyond the silence that had tried to consume her. Fatima Sultan had become something no power, no empire could destroy. A voice. Her story remains not just a tale of tragedy, but of courage, the quiet kind that burns even in darkness. She was born to royalty but died as truth, and in that truth, she found her freedom. Even now, when the moonlight falls upon the Bosphorus, and the old palace stands cloaked in mist, some say they can see her figure standing by the window where she once wept, watching the water flow beneath her. Silent, unbroken, eternal.